We on purpose make this conference a combination of practitioners, policymakers, and leading academics. And this is what we hear at this beautiful campus, Haas School of Business. And when I started my PhD in 2009, my professor told me, before you get into the nitty-gritty details of SAPs and standards, you got to read up the fundamentals of the economic papers and books of innovation management, strategy, and the capabilities of companies. And Professor David Teece's papers were one of those that I had to read, and I liked them very much. And I actually cited, probably at least in all of my articles that I ever published after, always David Teece's work. And I wasn't the only one. If you look at Google Scholar, I think some of your papers are cited like 50,000 times. So that shows there's more than just this specific world of patents and standards. There's a whole ecosystem of innovation strategy work out there. And I'm super happy that we have here today for a keynote, for our keynote, for the one keynote we have actually only, David Teece talking about the role of patents and standards for technology leadership. David, please come to the floor. Thanks for being here at your school. Thanks for having us here. And we're really excited to hear about your thoughts of the world of leadership and technology. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's my delight to be here, but more importantly, to have you here. We're in the business school, but right next to us is engineering. And one of the things that we have pushed ever since I came to this campus was bringing engineering and business closer together. And now we have joint programs and joint degrees, and it's really a critical part of our campus life. But it's also, as you've seen today, what we have to do in the real world, which is put technology, engineering, and business together to deal with complex issues and great opportunities. And so it's in that spirit that, I want to talk today at a very high level about intellectual property and standards and technology development. I want to give you a big picture perspective, and I'll actually begin with sort of my initial thinking, which was borrowed from the Nobel laureate Simon Kuznets way back, and this is actually a quote from my thesis. My thesis, believe it or not, as a doctoral student at Wharton School, was on technology transfer. I can tell you nobody was interested in that topic back then. There was something just being formed called the Licensing Executive Society, and I think it had 30 members back then. So things were kind of primitive in terms of the understanding of technology transfer, innovation, intellectual property. But that's not to say that the underlying activity wasn't vibrant already in the world economy. And this is what the quote from Simon Kuznets points out. Since the origins of technical and social innovations have never been confined to the borders of any one nation, the economic growth of all countries depends to some degree on the successful application of an international stock of knowledge. And that's what brings us here together. And in fact, the standardization process and what's behind it is really one of the great stories for civilization about knowledge sharing and knowledge combination. Now, it's kind of a pity, and I say this as an economist, that the field of economics has sort of neglected technology and innovation. And that spilled over into globalization. We've had all kinds of agreements on trade, and we've had agreements on investment, but really, and I think we're paying some of the price for it today, there's never really been much in a coordinated way between nation states around technology, because we didn't know how to talk about it. We didn't have models of innovation. And so, the construction of the WTO and so forth, innovation and technology is an afterthought, because nobody knew how to really talk sensibly about it and design regimes that would manage it well. So we have to realize that we're starting in some sense on the back foot. Despite the importance of technology to globalization, too much of the emphasis from a policy point of view has been on trade and investment. Now, what we know, and it was so instructive to listen to the last panel, not only is it a story about enormous improvements in technology over time, but it's a very complicated story. But basically, what I think you can say, I'll say it anyway and see if someone wants to contradict it, that wireless communications and the development of technologies with respect to wireless has been the most successful collaborative development of enabling technology in the history of the world. You know, anyone want to challenge that? There's certainly lots of bilateral exchanges and so forth, but in terms of a multilateral combinatorial activity that is substantially self-organized. I mean, to some extent, you know, a government's an enabler in the deep background. The courts are an enabler. But this is more or less a self-organized global cooperative arrangement. And we should not just take that for granted. It's the only one of great magnitude. And I will suggest it's a bit fragile, and it could all fall apart in today's world. So don't take it for granted. Understand how we got there, and let's work to make sure that it continues, because we'll all be losers if it falls apart, and it just might. Now, as I was thinking about this for today, and all the complexity and the lack of deep understanding of technology transfer, I thought about Pasteur's quadrant and where SEPs fit in. And actually, this didn't get updated, but really, you know, SEPs fit primarily on the right-hand side, and there's also a bunch of junk SEPs sitting in here. But all of this is to say that the origins of technology development and the value of technology development is deeply heterogeneous. And this is relevant in a world where government authorities and regulators want to do head counting in terms of the value of patent portfolios and so forth. We have to understand that there's different values associated with the nature of the technology itself. Obviously, the higher the commercial value, the higher the value of the SEP. And I would suggest that the more it depends on deep science, the greater the generality and likely the applicability, and the broader the patents, and the more valuable the patents. So the more valuable SEPs are the ones in those two quadrants. They're probably numerically more SEPs over here, but they don't matter, but they get caught up, and other people, when they're in the business of trying to evaluate patents, will naively suggest that all are the same. So deep heterogeneity and complexity is the world that we live in. Now, the other thing that took me a long time myself in various meetings I went to in the academic world, I found it very important. I don't think people are careful enough about the way they talk about this to distinguish between standard setting and standards development. I remember it was actually, well, not that long ago, perhaps 10 years ago, in a conference where actually somebody, I think it was from Cisco, was on the stage talking about standards developments in mobile and the difference between 2-pin plugs and 3-pin plugs, and it really doesn't make much difference, does it? And that was because they had in mind standards as compatibility, which of course is important. But behind it is standards development, and that's where people, you know, people that are writing for the press and so forth, people that have a superficial understanding, don't understand that standards meetings are not just about to agree on compatibility. It's about, you know, bringing forward great technologies and combining them in new and better ways to produce superior outcomes. So behind the standard setting process is a global research and development consortium, loosely organized, that powers these technologies forward. So for my students at least, if they're talking about this stuff, I put soap and water in their mouth if they say standard setting versus standards development, because it is a standards development operation where billions of dollars are spent by relatively few players. And what one also has to understand is that there's hundreds of as we heard, thousands of folks that are using the technology, but a much smaller number that are developing it and contributing in a major way. So, so that's the texture of the standards development and standard setting process, and those distinctions, I think, are very important. So really, standardization, you can think of it, and this is a quote from Erickson, as a framework for agreements amongst different parties, not just developers, but also users. I mean, where else do we have this arrangement where both users and developers come together to try and select technologies? But behind that selection process is years of research that have gone in, and in anticipation of a competition for the selection of the best technologies to go into standards. So there's a lot more than meets the eye with the standard setting process. And then behind it all, and this is a remarkable thing in a way, but because ETSI began in Europe, and there is some role for government in at least initiating this whole process. It's not a completely self-organized process. As I said, there was some spark provided by governments in Europe, and then there is the judicial system behind it. But that judicial system is global in nature, but the underlying law is French law. So you actually have an arrangement that I believe is a tribute to human cooperations and the working together of markets. It's really miraculous. Maybe in the discussion, someone will come up with an equal miracle that we can talk about to lay alongside this. But it's both a miracle, and miracles don't come along very often, but they can also disappear if you're not fully conscious of the underlying enabling and governance structures. So enough about that. Let me move on to point out that rivalry between China and the rest of the world is a complicating factor on top of this, because in the past, standard setting was basically a voluntary organization that was private sector driven, where individual scientists and engineers, well, mainly engineers, of course, were coming together, and it was government sort of was outside of it all. But it's become not only is it the user community much larger than the producing community, because now there's thousands of companies that are licensees or putative licensees with respect to technologies, but also governments are nosing into it and seeing the industrial policy implications of standardizations. So the complexity that comes from a very difficult task in the first place is now being amplified, if you will, by national interests in ways that it wasn't in the early days. So we have to be cognizant of the fact that the Chinese government has recognized that standards development bodies are very important, and they want to steer it in a particular way where it hasn't really been steered very much by governments in the past. Now, behind all of this, and this is where economics does come in, if you go along with me with the notion that standards technologies are enabling technologies, then I think you can rapidly come to the view that the social returns, and this is a term economists use, when we say social returns to innovation, we mean if you look up all the benefits that accrue to an innovation beyond that which accrues to the company that's actually producing the innovation. This is really an effort to measure what we call spillover effects. I mean, the one element of economics that's relevant here is that if returns, or at least if the ability to capture returns is different from the ability to develop the technology, then you'll get underinvestment in technology. So the reason why we justify investment in innovation by the government is because the public benefits are better than or greater than the private benefits. And in fact, there is this large literature in economics. When I say large, there's at least a dozen or so critical studies, of which I've put up 3 or 4 here that show the same thing, namely that the spillover effects and the public benefit or the social benefit is, 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 100x greater than the private benefit, which means that, one, the investment dollars behind standards development or any type of R&D are more precious than any other dollar we spend in the economy. And we don't get this type of return from investing in roads and railways. You do get, hopefully, some positive spillover effects. But the social returns to innovation are much greater than the private returns, which means that if government has a bias one way towards intellectual property, if you think of intellectual property as being one of the mechanisms, and not the only mechanism, by which developers get to capture value from their invention, if they're going to be biased one way or the other, they should be biased towards favoring those that are investing in the innovation, not the users. The users find other ways to capture value, but it's much harder, particularly if you're talking about something like standards. You've only got the patent system to rely upon. So if there's a bias from a policy point of view, it should be to favor the ability to capture returns from innovation, not the other way around. But as we'll see, the main direction of travel from governments is to try and find ways to skinny down the returns to the pioneering inventors, and that's contrary to what economic analysis and the empirical studies on innovation suggest is the right thing to do. So the fundamental problem, wearing my hat as an economist, is that royalties are depressed because this market, or the market for technology, the market for know-how, has got all kinds of difficulties associated with it. It's different from a typical commodity market because if you take patents in particular, they're not self-enforcing. Any other form of property, you can to some extent self-enforce its value. So for instance, if I have somebody walking across my front lawn, I have some ability to push them away and put up a fence or do something to prevent and protect my property. But with respect to patents, since patents are published, you don't have that right. In fact, you don't have that ability. It requires the legal system to assist you. So one of the very key elements of standards development is that if you're relying on patents, then you're starting off, if you will, with one hand tied behind your back if you don't have the courts fully behind you. That's not true if you're an implementer. Typically, while implementers, of course, are innovating too, they have the set of complementary assets that can be used to capture returns. So that's another piece of research I did in a paper in 1986 called Profiting from Innovation, where I pointed out that if you have weak intellectual property, then the only way you can capture value is through having complementary assets, and you capture return from the complements. But in the case of standards development, that's much harder to do, and a lot of companies that involved in, or at least some of the companies involved in standards development, essentially have to rely on royalties as the way to compensate for the R&D costs that they incur. So we have an economic problem, if you will, of depressed royalties, and that can jeopardize continued investment. And let me just bring this back to home with a statement that I like to quote Nobel laureates because it makes what I say more legitimate. If you don't believe me, then maybe you'll believe a Nobel laureate. And Ken Arrow, who was a Nobel laureate at Stanford, and in fact, his very last public appearance was in this room where he made these points all over again about a year and a half ago. And he said, isn't it curious, this is an economist, why is it that you can't get as much money for your technology through licensing than if you embed it in goods and sell the goods? And he was puzzled by it. And he made that statement back in 1962. He says, it really calls for some explanation why the firm that has developed the knowledge cannot demand a greater share of the resulting profits. He's referring to that social returns literature, which shows all of these spillovers. He says, what is it? And then, 50 years later, he's still got the same puzzle. And the answer, of course, is that patents aren't self-enforcing. He's thinking of it as an economist. And if you look at Arrow's models, they assume perfect property right in a patent. And in fact, 99% of economists think that's what a patent is. They think that it has an injunction sort of built inside it, such that if somebody infringes your patent, you can immediately stop them. 99 out of 100 economists have that view of what a patent is. And so not surprisingly, they don't have a very realistic view of the licensing problem. And Arrow had that view, even though he's a Nobel laureate. And the answer, of course, is the patents are not self-enforcing, and the courts are critical to capturing value through a licensing strategy. And if the courts are not there, then the whole thing falls apart. And we're aware, someone can perhaps update me on this, but I know the IEEE sort of stepped into this, dominated more by a user perspective, and in my view, made some changes that were controversial at the time, that weakened the IP rights policy that they had before. And I suspect that in the end of the day, it didn't do them any good, or didn't do the economy any good, but time will tell. And now the EU is jumping in, engaging in what I call nirvana economics. There are a lot of imperfections in the market for know-how. I mean, it's amazing it works at all. To me, the most amazing thing is not that you have difficulty getting licenses consummated as IP owners. The amazing thing is that you actually accomplish that at all. And because it's a very clunky market, because as economists will tell you, when property rights are unclear, transactions don't happen. When property rights are clear, transactions happen. This is a famous Coase theorem. It doesn't really, his theory was it didn't really matter who had property rights, so long as they're clear, people can self-organize around that. So there are a lot of frictions in this market, but does that mean it's, quote, a market failure of the kind that requires the government to step in and regulate? No, it doesn't. The private voluntary system, as clunky as it is, has worked reasonably well. There's a lot of imperfections, there's a lot of frictions, but there's no clear substitute through government action other than maybe strengthening the right to enjoin. But in fact, regulating it would probably make things worse and have a lot of other knock-on effects. And Harold Dempsitz, an economist from UCLA, coined the term nirvana economics, that a lot of people that design public policy think they can always fix everything. And if everything is not in perfect equilibrium all the time, then it requires the government to intervene in some fashion. And most of us don't believe that's the case because the economics of nirvana is an ideal world that we can't really expect to create on Earth. And I've noticed in this regard, bringing myself a little bit up to date, because I don't follow all of these developments as closely as most of you do, but the EU has jumped in with a potential program of regulation on royalty rates, which I don't think is a very good idea at all, particularly since it's based on royalty caps, where there's no clear methodology being put forward for what those caps should be, or how the whatever the amount of total cumulative royalty is considered legitimate, how that should be allocated. And given the Pasteur quadrant issue, that shouldn't surprise anybody. So it requires a top-down approach, and You know, there's no economic principles that justify a top-down approach. Top-down is something that's been invented in litigation, but it really doesn't have a strong intellectual foundation in economics. And I think a lot of this grumbling has perhaps emerged because of IoT, and there's a lot of new players in IoT. And what you have to realize is that there's always the case that there's going to be more on the user side of technology than there are on the developer side. Someone mentioned earlier on the stage that most of the contributions come from, you know, a couple of handfuls of key players. And there's literally not tens of thousands yet, but maybe tens of thousands of potential users. And so if the process becomes politicized, there's more voices saying, I want to pay low royalties than there are saying, pay me a royalty that will enable me to continue to invest to bring you the benefits that I've brought you in the past. So, you know, we have to realize that, you know, when Etsy got started, there were a few handfuls of contributors, maybe one handful of contributors, and most of the companies that were the users were in the United States or in Europe. Now, of course, it's truly global, and East Asia is where most of the implementers are, and so the geopolitics of the situation becomes relevant. But as we think about all of these issues, besides appealing to the Nobel laureates, one also should look at the economic historians. And Petra Moser has done a study of the late 19th century innovation and shown quite convincingly to the academic community that when IP rights are weakened, resources flow elsewhere. And so that's what I think we have to worry about, what the EU needs to keep in mind as we think about these issues. So my solution, of course, is we need to strengthen injunctive rights, or the right to enjoin, which is very, very hard to get in the United States. Ironically, the United States used to be a champion of patents, but other countries can perhaps claim that a little more securely than the U.S. can today. So absent the right to enjoin, it's very, very hard to enforce IP rights, at least to enforce patents. Trade secrets or copyright is somewhat easier. So what should governments be doing? In my view, instead of thinking about regulating FRAND rates, like the Europeans are thinking, they should be trying to strengthen the standards development process itself and being very careful when there are export controls and other things that are being developed, that it doesn't have negative knock-on effects to the participation of leading companies in the standards development process. You know, I learned today that there's literally hundreds of people that now show up to the standards development process, and if U.S. companies or European companies are excluded or not encouraged to attend, then that has a negative effect. So doubling down on everything so we have the best engineers and that we can populate these meetings with competent people that are actually trying to develop the best standards, that makes for a better situation for the entire world, and that's the direction of travel that I favor. So my concluding observations are that we now have you know, not only to think about what's a fair and reasonable non-discriminatory royalty rate, but also there's a strategic dimension that's creeping into standards development that wasn't there early on as national governments get involved and as national security issues crop up as well. So we started off with a world, and we have a world where we have this miraculous cooperation between companies in many different countries. That miraculous cooperation is now being impinged upon by national security issues and national industrial policy questions. And so the complexity that we've had on the past, I think, is only going to become more amplified. And if we don't watch ourselves, the whole thing could collapse. And what would it collapse to? And this is the point that most people don't realize. You know, we have fundamentally an open innovation model working through a global system of standards development. It's not the only way that technology could be developed. It could be developed through a vertically integrated model. And you would have companies that, a few large companies, maybe user-based, that might come together in limited ways to achieve compatibility, but the open innovation model would disappear. And competition, in my view, would be reduced. And I find it therefore incredibly ironic that the Federal Trade Commission of the United States was a champion implicitly through the FTC case against Qualcomm, whether they knew it or not. They're great champions for open innovation, but they were about to actually deliver a huge blow to the open innovation model. The open innovation model may collapse of its own complexity in due course, in which case it'll be Huawei, Apple, and Google, and a few others that sort of come together, and that's all that's left of it, and innovation will proceed. It'll still proceed at a much slower rate. But I think the world has gotten enormous benefits by being able to tap into a global pool of knowledge and create incentives for people to work cooperatively on a global basis. And I think we need to remind people that if you don't support that system, what you'll get in the alternative is basically an oligopolistic system that won't be anywhere near as good and won't be as innovative, starve users of the innovation that they've experienced in the past. But it will still continue. It'll just continue at a lower rate and be much more strategically manipulated. So let's hope we don't go there. And active debate and getting people to understand that we've actually got a miracle here of human cooperation and of global cooperation. Let's see if we can't keep that going for not just generations of technology, but for generations of people. Thank you. I'm happy to take a couple of questions if there are any. Otherwise, I think you get lunch. Curdy.
So I'll ask David. We heard in this last panel about growing participation from China in the standards, right?
Yes.
And, a couple of things I observed from your talk. One is that if investments in standards are not going to be, it's harder to monetize, I think, as you were saying, the return on investment from the arrow theory and what we're seeing. Then where do investments flow? And are we seeing that? And then the second question was, as you were saying, I think our last panel talked about growing investments from China in these standards. Not perhaps following the same market forces, but there are growing investments from Chinese companies in the R&D. So how do we square that with your suggestion that we should maybe have standards meetings held in the EU and US? Are you talking about balkanizing the standards process, or you had something else?
No, I'm not advocating balkanizing it at all. But I think China seems to operate in a coordinated way, and I think perhaps we need some degree of coordination on the other side amongst companies and countries to ensure that we get a more balanced approach and we don't get, if you will, we don't get more fragmented. So getting some common understandings, however that happens, amongst technical folks and having the support of governments rather than the opposition of governments is the world that I'm hoping for. Yes?
One of the things that I find interesting is certainly implementers that contribute to the standards.
Yes.
Spend R&D money and invest in it. Are there any studies that compare the competitive advantage that companies that don't contribute to the standard but implement them have over companies that do devote R&D to developing the standard?
No, you raise a good point, and implementers are important. But here's the fundamental point, and this is, if I can push my own research is the most cited paper in the whole field of technology management is my 1986 paper called Profiting from Innovation. It says that, you know, it's very hard if you're just a technology developer and you're not an implementer. You don't have the complementary assets. It's very hard to get a decent return to your technology. So the implementers have, in the words of Ken Arrow, a much easier appropriability challenge. This is the key point. This is what Nobel laureate Ken Arrow is thinking. Why don't the people that just do research, why can't they earn a living from it? And the answer is the spillover effects are such that you almost have to have a complementary asset. You know, if you don't have chips as well as technology, it's much harder to get a decent license. But it's also important for the implementers. If the implementers have got the sale of devices as a way to capture returns. I mean, if you think about it, when I was in graduate school, there was only one research company that existed that earned its living from royalties. It was called Universal Oil Products. And I scratched my head. You know, we learned from Adam Smith that specialization and the division of labor are the essence of a capitalist system. Why don't you have specialist research companies that just earn their living through licensing? Well, because the market for technology is very imperfect. And if you don't have the courts backing you up, you won't get paid that way. So in today's language, the business model doesn't work for a pure research organization. So, you know, companies that may get started, then they get bought by another company. That's the way in which they capture value. But the market for know-how is riddled with imperfections, and if the government layers on more, you kill it completely, and open innovation disappears. This is the most basic, fundamental point that I can't understand why other people don't understand, and the public doesn't understand. And so I have this paper called Profiting from Innovation, where I say, listen, why is it the puzzle? This is the only time I've been mobbed in an auditorium. When I presented this paper in Silicon Valley in the mid-'80s, you know, the puzzle is, why do the pioneers lose so often? The answer is because they don't have a proper monetization strategy. And if they're just relying, if they got the best technology, it doesn't win you a seat. It doesn't win you the crown. Just having technology doesn't win you the crown because there's no market for technology that is working the way that physical goods markets work. So what do you have to do? You've got to put that technology into a product and sell a product. That's the way you capture value. So that's why government should be propping up intellectual property, and then you would get a spawning. And this is the paradox of the FTC, in my view. You know, they love all of these small and medium-sized organizations, but then they go and sidle with an Apple, like in the FTC case, and go against their own doctrine. Why? Because the fundamental Arrow conundrum, which he never answered, isn't understood, except by smart people like yourselves. Yes?
Hey, Professor Teece, I have a question about your top-down approach. I'm in the licensing business, and I do understand the logic behind top-down and apportionment and trying to figure out what your portion should be equated to. I see that more as a repricing than trying to do a price determination, but nevertheless. I don't face it very often in a private negotiation, but when I do hear it, I hear these remarks about the fact like, hey, as you know, the total aggregate royalty rate on 4G is 6 to 8%. And you know, the courts have used those numbers and when doing a top-down determinations and whatnot. From your point of view and in the academic field, has there ever been any empirical data or study trying to figure out what that top-down total aggregate royalty rate ought to be? Because I have no idea where that number came from other than some people just spitting it out.
Actually, I have a half-finished paper which has got some deep econometrics in with other people who are doing the econometrics that I've never had a chance to finish. But it's very hard to do it, but there are some papers out there that sort of are groping in the right direction that have a chance, but no, there's no definitive study in the academic world as of today. Which means, of course, it's open to a political process. When you don't have solid research, then everyone walks in and politics wins. And you can be sure that there are more voices on the user side than there are on the developer side. So when politics and the environment we're talking about here means low royalties or no royalties. On that somber note, it's a free lunch though, so well, I appreciate you all coming.
We have lunch in the back. Just one comment here from my